Okay, look, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who probably just stood up before as an international delegate, Evan McKenzie, if you'd like to come up to the stage, Evan. Evan is a professor of political science at the University of Illinois at Chicago and an adjunct professor at the John Marshall Law School. He holds a PhD from the University of Southern California and a JD from the University of California at Los Angeles Law School. He is the author of 2 books and numerous academic articles and book chapters on homeowner and condominiums associations. He sometimes serves as legal counsel and expert litigation consultant in community association matters. Please welcome Evan McKenzie.
Who's doing the slides?
So this will, there you go, and that advances the slides.
Excellent. All right.
That takes you back, and you've got a beam as well. There's a beam should you want it.
Excellent.
Forward, backwards, beam.
Got it. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for inviting me to participate in the conference and the rest of the committee as well. I really appreciate the opportunity. And this is a topic I've been interested in for many years, starting in about 1985. And it's amazing to see how things have changed to date in the last few years. And so I welcome the opportunity to start thinking about what's happening now, what changes confront this institution and the years to come. And so that's what I've tried to do, and I hope you find it interesting. My intention here was to try to imagine a little bit, and not so much to predict, because Niels Bohr was a famous physicist, and he said prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And I tried to keep that in mind, so I try to confine my predictions to the past or the present, wherever possible. But in any event, and particularly in this area, this is this type of housing we're talking about. It isn't just a type of housing, it's also enmeshed in the governance of communities now. In other words, it's a governing institution of sorts, as well as a way of people organizing their neighborhoods and their buildings. And so because of the complexity, this institution connects with many, many different things that are happening in the world, and that's what I've tried to do, is begin to think about what those things are. So here's the big overview. I grouped the changes into 4 sections here: technological changes, socio-economic changes, cultural and political changes, and environmental changes. And I'm simply going to go through these. So technological changes, connectivity, big data, and potentially extending the human lifespan. Secondly, socioeconomic changes, urbanization, income and wealth stratification, and residential segregation by income, and globalization. Cultural and political changes include revitalization of central cities, the end of the notion that there is one majority group in a nation or in a polity, and political polarization. And then lastly, environmental changes, including climate change, water supply depletion, and energy. So beginning with the technological changes, let me jump right into this. Connectivity, big data, and extending the human lifespan. So in connectivity, what I'm speaking of here is this, that we are now at a time when the transaction costs involved in connecting with other people are approaching zero. In other words, where it is possible to use a whole variety of media platforms to connect with people who have similar interests with almost no effort at all. And this is a revolutionary change. And these new media platforms I've listed, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so forth, but they're now, those platforms are now connected with major media as well. So that events that take place and online and are put online can find their way into major media outlets almost overnight. What does this amount to? Well, first, there's a two-way street here. On the one hand, I think associations are taking advantage of connectivity, and developers, in fact, when they create developments, are taking advantage of connectivity to find ways to connect people who have similar interests very easily. So they can run a questionnaire out to the population. Disney did this with the community celebration in Orlando, Florida. And everyone who comes into celebration, a huge planned community, is asked what their interests are. And then this all goes into a database. And then when someone wanders into the community center and says they want to start a soccer team, they can instantly pull up a list of everyone who's ever expressed an interest in soccer or whatever it might be, and they can hook them up together and get it started. In other words, as they put it, they can jumpstart a sense of community in a development. And that's something that took a lot of effort in previous decades, and now it can be done very quickly. You can do other things as well. You can run meetings, association meetings and so forth online. And I think people are doing this already, and you know what I'm talking about. Association records are increasingly available online, meeting minutes, governing documents, many other documents. And that's really significant, but it also has to be kept in mind that this is now a two-way street, because this technology empowers people who are not just on the boards or not just developers. It empowers everybody. I mean, anyone with a cell phone or a computer, an iPad, can do all these things. And so people can launch their own media and websites, and at almost no cost. And in a moment, I want to give an example of this in connection with what I call big data. But the opportunities now in the facility for people to organize in opposition to associations or to their government, or to publicize things that went on inside these communities has never been greater, and it can be done with almost no effort at all. So I'll move along and then combine that with big data. Now, well, the term big data has no real accepted definition, but the idea is that digitization of data has now become so easy that the amount of data available for analysis exceeds the capability for analyzing it greatly. And conventional data tools and statistical analysis techniques are actually inadequate to the task of dealing with the amount of data that is online or that can be put online. Now, again, on the one hand, this is a wonderful thing, because developers and managers can now do a much better job than they ever did before of targeting specific groups of people. And so you can envision the kind of targeted marketing or niche marketing that is done with associations. Now you can, to market particular developments to particular groups of people with certain interests. That's always been done, but the technology has never been there to do it with the sophistication that exists now. In the political world, because I'm a political scientist, we talk a lot about this. Historically, we group people into liberal and conservative and moderate and this sort of thing. Well, now, no political consultant actually thinks in those terms. There are 0 consultants who think in those terms. None. All the people who actually make their living doing this have broken down the body politic, the population, into the tiniest, most microscopic groups. They analyze every conceivable kind of record that is online, everything you can possibly imagine, private and public, things having to do with what YouTube videos you watch and Facebook, Twitter feed, all this. And this is all going into gigantic databases, and they target people with specific email campaigns, snail mail campaigns, and this sort of thing. And the same developers will be doing the same thing, if they aren't already. That is, target marketing developments to particular people. And this raises some issues, because it makes it possible, probably, to create very homogeneous developments of people with very, very similar interests in ways that could not be done before. But that's not all, though, because again, this is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. So, for example, now, authority figures can be held accountable. And I say authority figures, broadly speaking. The people who run associations and police officers. I'm going to use police officers as an example. This video, this picture that you see right here, this is from a city called Rohnert Park in Northern California. This is part of a video. It's a still from a video that went viral instantly. I mean, overnight. The man who shot this was in his front yard, and he happened to have his cell phone with him, and he was doing something in his front yard. He as a police officer, that police officer drove past. He just videotaped the officer, because the officer drove past his house once or twice. So he wondered, what's he doing? So he just took out his camera. Again, he's in his front yard, and he starts videotaping the officer. And the officer came running over, and you see what's in his right hand? The officer came running over and drew his pistol. And at this man who had done nothing more than shoot a short video of him as he drove by his front yard. That instantly was on national news. The next day, it was on national news. And you can imagine, there are going to be consequences for this. This is only one of many examples of this, where video and other types of information have been, and usually it's cell phone video, surveillance camera video, something of this sort, instantly goes viral. And it instantly becomes a matter of public concern. So now the effect of that, and this is I'm using the metaphor or the example of police as a way to think about what could happen potentially with community association leaders. For many, many years, interactions between police and civilians that went out on the street, were basically invisible. That is, the police department created the entire record of what happened in these interactions. There was no video. There was no audio. There was nothing except police officers saying one thing happened and another person who was arrested or shot or something saying something else happened. But that's gone now. That situation has changed forever, and it will never go back to being like it was before, because now there are records of thousands of these encounters. There are Facebook pages consisting of nothing but viral videos of police-civilian encounters. I mean, the whole situation has completely changed. A relationship that was once entirely invisible and controlled by one party, the police officers, has now gone upside down. And the consequences are very far-reaching. We now see police officers being charged with murder and this sort of thing. Now, I'm not saying anything's good or bad or indifferent here. I'm simply saying this situation has radically changed. Overnight, it has changed in a very short time. And I think the same thing is true with associations. The big data and connectivity mean that authority figures can be held accountable in ways that they never could in the past. And I think this will affect the world of community associations because individuals can do things such as record association meetings. I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of disputes arising over whether someone can come in and set up a video camera and shoot the whole meeting and this sort of thing. Well, then no one's going to bother with that anymore. I mean, you can for $100 you can buy a camera that goes in your buttonhole. You know, and the things that go on in the common areas, slip and fall accidents, arguments, parking disputes, all this stuff has the potential to become viral video. And you never really know what people will find interesting about it, you know, what will cause it to catch on. And so things that are said in board or member meetings may end up on YouTube. In the paper, I have I linked to a YouTube video of a very fascinating encounter in an association meeting that results in a fist fight that you can actually hear taking place on the YouTube video. So this is just an uncontrollable, what these relationships have become uncontrollable as a result of video. Anyone could potentially see them, anything can become public, and nothing can be held truly private in association matters. And I'll add one more thing on this point, which is we use the term datafication. In other words, that almost anything now can be turned into digital data, which then has the potential to go online. Well, think about association records, things that were once private, association accounting information, things of this sort. Well, you know, there's going to be, imagine if all of that were public. Imagine if all of it were public, if all the association meeting minutes, contracts, all their financial records, if all of that became public. Now, in years past, this was only paper, and it would have to be physically stolen for that to happen. And now, is that true any longer? And I think, no, it isn't. And so this has to be considered. And I'll touch on a little bit more on another aspect of that in a moment. But I think it could lead to greatly increased transparency of association matters. Now, while we're still in the realm of the first category here, we're still technological changes. Lastly, this is a little more speculative, but the possibility for extending the human lifespan. Obviously, the housing market has been greatly affected in the last 50 years by gradual extensions of the human lifespan. The creation of retirement communities would not even be possible if it were not for the fact that there are so many people living longer. This is what has made retirement communities such a profitable area of real estate development. But now what is being talked about is not just gradual increase in longevity, but potentially greatly increasing the human lifespan. In other words, changing the meaning of old age, not just preventing premature death. A lot of our gains to date have been caused by inoculations and operations, things that prevent premature death, but extending what has always been considered the normal human lifespan, sometimes called radical life extension. This gentleman, Craig Venter, is the president of a corporation in Orange County, California, Synthetic Genomics, that is actually trying to do this. And there are many companies doing this. The Pew Foundation, I have a quotation in the paper about talking about the ramifications of this, which are almost beyond comprehension. That is, if human beings could count on living to 120, potentially, 120, what would that do to the housing market? Now, it's mind-boggling to comprehend what this would mean. When would people retire? I mean, if they could, will people start working until they're 90 or 100, or will they retire when they're 70 and live in a retirement community until they're 120? I mean, this is a change that I think we really have to ponder. This is simply a graph showing what has happened with life expectancy just from 1960 to the present. And what I think is most interesting about this is that, just to ponder this, what if there is a great increase in life expectancy in the developing world, which is where it would be the easiest to make the greatest gains? What would that do? And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment in connection with socioeconomic changes, of which I have three. One, urbanization. Two, income and wealth stratification and segregation by income. And then third, globalization. Urbanization, what we're referring to here is the movement of population from rural areas to urban areas, which has been underway since the mid-18th century. But it has accelerated rapidly in the last few decades. The United Nations Population Fund reported recently we are now witnessing unprecedented population growth in cities across the globe. So that, I'll give you a few quick statistics. As of 2008, more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas for the first time in human history. That is 3.3 billion people. But by the year 2030, the urban population will reach 5 billion. 80%, and at that point, 80% of the urban population of the world will be living in developing areas, in cities in the developing world. Now, this is really astounding. So think about it this way. If you asked yourself, in Africa and Asia alone, which is where it is expected that the urban population will double between 2000 and 2030, what that means is, through all of recorded history, I mean from the beginning of civilization until the year 2000, think about how many people in Africa and Asia lived in cities. In the 30-year period from 2000 to 2030, that number will double. In 30 years, it will double. And we're halfway through that period right now. So the demand for new housing, new urban housing in the developing world is, it cannot be, it's impossible really to overstate how significant this is. And this is underway in a number of nations right now, and I think it's probably reflected in the international composition of the delegates to this conference. I've been to a number of different international conferences recently on this matter, and you see people coming in from all parts of the world, not just, we have here people from South Africa and the Middle East, but everywhere you can possibly imagine. There's an estimated 250 million people living in common interest communities in China. A quarter of a billion people, at least, in China alone. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, when people decide to make a movement like this, when they decide to move from the countryside into the city, a whole lot of things have to change. They need not only housing, but they need infrastructure. And the question is, who builds the infrastructure? And in many cases, the local governments that might be in charge of such a project do not have the capacity to do it. This often leads, in many parts of the world, to the private sector, so to speak, being required to do it. In other words, the developers who build the housing also build the infrastructure. And this has been going on in the United States, and I've been talking about this now for 30 years, but it's happening all over the world now, where the construction of infrastructure is becoming a private or a private-public partnership matter. And so when private infrastructure is created, the question then arises, who maintains it? Who's responsible for it? And in many cases, that is going to be, and is in fact, community associations, residential private governments, or whatever they're called in these various countries. And again, we end up with volunteers, often untrained, unsupported, in charge of major infrastructure systems. And that is probably going to be necessary. Also, real estate markets in developing parts of the world will have enormous impact on the global economy. When the U.S. real estate market tanked in 2007, 2008, it sent financial shockwaves across the world. So let me ask you, what do you think would happen if the Chinese real estate market disintegrated the way the U.S. market did? What would that do? See? I mean, who would prop it up? What would be the consequences? And I think this is something that the future holds. Not that it's going to collapse tomorrow, but I mean, I certainly hope not. But over time, the health and the safety and the security of those markets will become increasingly important. Income and wealth stratification and segregation. There are two very well documented trends that have taken place since about 1970. One of them is a dramatic increase in income inequality, income and wealth inequality across the developed world. That is, in a sense, ameliorated in a global sense by a growing middle class in places like China and India and a number of other places. But throughout Europe, and very much so in the United States, we see an increase in inequality. That is, rich getting a much larger share of annual growth, and others getting much less. And so there's a kind of a dumbbell effect going on. At the same time, the other trend that we see is increasing residential segregation by wealth and income. And almost everyone who has studied this agrees that one is a contributing cause to the other. In other words, that if you see people separating more and more by income, if you see a society becoming more a society of rich and poor, they won't live in the same places. And they won't buy the same type of housing. The rich can bid the price of housing up for what they want and put it out of the reach of what people of middle and lower income want. And so that has a lot of consequences. The interesting question is, strata title or common interest development housing is implicated in this. I just did a paper on this it's coming out in a book published by the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy in a month or two, called Land in the City. So I analyzed all the literature all the empirical studies that have been done on this topic. Common interest housing, it pops up in a number of the papers that have been done on segregation by income, and it's a complicated picture. Because on the one hand, this type of housing, particularly if you keep in mind that the target marketing that can be done with this type of development, it facilitates sorting people by wealth and income with price points and other features as well. And so most of the analysts who have studied this have concluded that common interest housing does contribute to segregation by income. On the other hand, a number of people have pointed out in some really excellent papers that there are many situations, particularly with urban redevelopment areas, where it's possible to entice affluent people to live in mixed income neighborhoods by giving them their own government, their own property, a sense of security, and so forth. And so urban revitalization, which I'm going to get to in a minute, is to some extent premised on the ability to use private communities in order to give affluent people this sense of security and sense of a place of their own. So it can be used in either way. It can be used to segregate people, or it can be used to create mixed income neighborhoods. Both of which, so it has potential in either direction. Globalization. And so globalization, as we know, is about the rapid international integration of economic, social, intellectual, and political activity. And it's fueled by all sorts of technological advances, primarily in communication and transportation, that have made this communication possible. But also because public policies have been put in place that dropped trade barriers and that made it possible for this trade and these technological advances to connect people across the globe. Now, this is very interesting because globalization has had all sorts of impact on housing. When we look around the world, we see, as I mentioned earlier, similar things popping up all over the world. We see developments in all parts of the globe that look similar. And I've been part of international networks that have been studying this for a long time, and there's this recurring question, which is, well, how do we explain the fact that the same thing is happening in so many different countries? That, in South Africa and China and Great Britain and Australia and the US, you see similar types of developments, different nomenclature, of course, different rules, but why do you see the same thing happening? And there are two main answers to this that have been offered. One is policy diffusion. We call it in political science policy diffusion. In other words, the idea that the notion is that an idea was invented in one place, and then it spreads. Someone builds a car in one place, and then they say, we could use those seat belts elsewhere, and they just start popping up. The same thing pops up because the idea spreads. And the other theory that has been used to explain this is that the same conditions exist in many different countries, and that the same conditions give rise to the same solutions. So, for example, if my own research and others have suggested that if you have a rapid growing urban population or suburban population, if you have a suddenly increasing demand of a lot of people to live in a certain area, that it will tend, in most cases, to overpower the ability of local government to satisfy all the infrastructure and service demands of that population, which in turn leads to reliance on the real estate development industry to build private infrastructure and then to pass along to private communities the maintenance responsibility for it. And if you see those conditions, that is rapid population growth and limited government capacity to provide for it, at the same time, then you would expect these private solutions to pop up, these privatized solutions to pop up. A third way to look at it is to say it's both. In other words, that the similar conditions are happening all over the world because of globalization, because of urbanization. These conditions exist. And people look around and they say, well, how are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to meet this challenge or address this need and allow this growth to take place? And they then, in a short time, you can find the answers. And you can find answers. You can contact the Urban Land Institute, the Community Associations Institute, any number of organizations, and they have ready-made proposals and solutions and suggestions and consultants and so forth. And so in a sense, it's both diffusion and the same conditions leading to the same concerns. That's the way I look at it in any event. Oops, wrong button. Cultural and political changes. I have three. One is the revitalization of central cities. Second, the end of this notion that there is a majority, a definable majority in countries. And third, political polarization. Now, on this revitalization of central cities, let me back up. I teach courses in urban politics. And in the urban politics literature, not just in the United States, but around the world, it was interesting because throughout the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, there was this doom and gloom period in which almost everybody, they were competing with each other, almost, scholars, to go to great extremes in predicting the end of cities. I mean, it was almost like one of my favorite movies, Mad Max and the Road Warrior, from made here, I guess. I love those movies. But there were these apocalyptic pictures of the future of cities. And science fiction is full of these apocalyptic futures, as we all know. But in the urban literature, my colleague Dennis Judd, who founded the urban politics section of the American Political Science Association, he said that urban scholars during the 80s were becoming like end-time prophets, predicting the end of cities. It was almost like a competition to see how bad you predicted it would get. Now, everyone's poster child for that in the United States is the city of Detroit, which, if you've gone online and looked at any of the pictures, there are actually entire websites devoted to nothing but photos of the dilapidated buildings and collapsed railroad stations and museums and this sort of thing that have been abandoned. And that's certainly, there are such cities. But what people missed throughout in the urban politics literature was that in the 90s, a renaissance started in many cities in the United States and around the world. And it involves a solution, a complex solution of combining a variety of features into what Dennis Judd has called a tourist bubble. In other words, redefining cities as places to play. Deindustrialization and the shipping of manufacturing jobs to other countries and so forth really undermines cities as places to manufacture. Detroit collapsed because the auto industry left and never came back. And obviously there are many examples. But many cities around the globe said, well, we don't really need that much manufacturing. We can redefine ourselves as service sector cities and as places for tourism. Tourism is a wonderful source of tax revenues because you don't have to tax your own citizens. If you can attract tourists, they come into the city, spend their money, you can tax them to death, and they're happy to pay it, and then they leave. There's a certain standard package that goes along with this. The cities that have done this, and it involves a lot of public expenditure. The cities have to set themselves up to do this. So you create festival malls, a James Rouse sort of mall, a mall that is not just a place to shop, but a place to enjoy, almost like a fair, a carnival, a mall that you go through, and it has artists displaying their work, and it has musicians playing, it has an atrium and this sort of thing. You know what I'm talking about. These malls are central to this type of urban redevelopment. So are stadiums and sports teams that attract people's attention. Luxury hotels, such as this one. And cultural activities, street life, places to walk and see things. Now cities, these packages, this standard package of amenities can be found in dozens of cities all over the world, dozens and dozens of cities. And they're not all gigantic cities either. Some of the biggest cities didn't have to do this. London and Paris probably didn't have to really do it this way, but other cities did. Chicago certainly did that. New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and many cities around the globe have done this. They create this enclave, this tourist enclave, which is full of museums and cultural activities. And then the idea is you can attract people to live in a city like that. You can attract corporate employees, service sector employees who want that kind of life. And this can transform downtown real estate markets. So what goes along with that then is housing for those people, which in almost all cases involves condominiums or some type of strata title. That's what they live in. And so revitalization of central cities has created an opportunity for private developers to work with public planners to build enormous numbers of new housing developments or redeveloped housing developments all around these tourist bubble areas and bring middle class and the upper class back into the city again, which has enormous impacts on the housing market. Then we come to the end of the majority. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this gentleman. Yes. The United States and a number of other nations around the world are experiencing demographic shifts that have undermined the notion that there is a definable majority group in the country that has some sort of greater claim to make it their country, you see. And this is, and I know everyone understands what I'm talking about here. This is going on all over the world, though. And it produces in many people a kind of a nativist reaction, but a lot of this is simply the result, probably, of globalization and the fact that borders don't mean what they used to mean anymore, and many different kinds of social and political transformations that have taken place where groups of people who were marginalized are saying they don't want to be marginalized anymore, and their numbers increase. Now, I think this is significant for strata title because these are I think, inexorable, sort of inevitable social transformations that are just going to take place. And it's that Western societies and European societies, Australia, New Zealand, many countries are simply going to become much more diverse as time goes by. And this, again, this provides a lot of opportunities probably for people in the housing industry to respond to this. To respond to this in ways that, you can view people as new groups of consumers, so to speak. However, I also think that there's a challenge here because my analysis of it, when you look at this gentleman over here with the big smile there, is that it produces it can produce polarized politics. And in political science, when we see polarized situations, when we see people splitting apart with what we call reinforcing cleavages, where people are divided not just by income, but by race or by religion or nationality and sort of thing, cleavages sort of add up. It tends to paralyze government. That governments end up in stalemates, where they don't do a very good job of coming up with pragmatic solutions to problems. Now, I would venture to say that most of you are probably pragmatic people. In other words, you probably tend to say, well, if there's a problem, let's try to find a solution to it, and let's try to make things work. And it's very frustrating for people in the real estate development industry or attorneys or practitioners in almost any field when they go to government to find paralysis. where you say, look, we have a consensus here, here's what we need to do, and then you can't get the government to move because they're internally squabbling with each other. And this is happening in many places. It's an enormous problem in the United States. Our Congress has been absolutely paralyzed now since 2010. In the state of Illinois, I'm at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The state of Illinois, we have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, and we have no state budget. They are completely at odds. The state government is shutting down because they have no budget to fund it. And no end in sight of this. Absolutely no end in sight. And it's not just there, it's happening in many places. So what does that mean? I think it means that this can be viewed actually as an opportunity, because in situations of paralysis, professional organizations and private institutions can develop their own solutions and step forward. And so I think that this has been done. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of this. In the insurance industry, this happens a lot, but during the 1980s particularly, the insurance industry decided to basically rewrite comprehensive general liability insurance policies. They changed them, they rewrote exclusions, and they came up with these what we call plain language insurance policies that were much easier for ordinary people to understand in auto and in homeowners insurance than ever before. And these were primarily, I'm not saying governments were not involved, but these were almost entirely private initiatives of private institutions saying, this is something we should do. This would make things work better. If we wait around for government to do it, it'll never happen. And the same thing, I think, can happen in this industry. In other words, that if organizations in this industry begin to address some of these issues and come up with solutions to problems, to challenges, they can probably get them passed. This is the sort of thing that breaks through a bipartisan, or it creates bipartisan consensus. If the interested parties come with a proposal to government and government doesn't have to come up with it, it's more likely to get adopted. And so, such as, plain language governing documents, instead of 200 pages of legalese. I've been arguing about this for the last 30 years at least, that, giving people 200 pages of gibberish, and when they buy a house and saying, well, a deal is a deal. You're bound by that thing on page 73 that you couldn't possibly have understood without a law degree. This is really not productive to do this. These declarations should be reduced in length to something that people can actually understand. And this is a challenge for the legal profession, because as a practicing attorney for many years, I understand that legalese is near and dear to our hearts. I get that. We love this stuff. These beautifully crafted but the rest of the world is just they want to tear their hair out when they see this. The same thing with standards and ratings and financial oversight. I think that there needs to be a lot more financial oversight for the reserves, or what you would call the sinking funds of associations. I think it's a huge, huge issue. And if you wait for government, I don't believe government is going to step forward and provide that oversight, probably. And therefore, there are ways that the industry could do this. I'll suggest one really quickly. I know some attorneys and accountants who actually are trying to make this happen, but as things currently stand, if a potential buyer wants to know about the finances of an association, it's almost impossible for them to find out. They usually only acquire the right to see the financials of an association, not just the unit they're buying, but the association's financials, after they have entered into a real estate contract to purchase. And then there's a disclosure period. Well, and then I think that may be too late. I think that the reason I think it's too late is because wouldn't it be better if everybody running every association thought it was important that they had adequate reserves or sinking funds? Wouldn't it be great if everybody felt that way? And how could you get to that state of affairs? Well, you could if they knew that any potential buyer could see a simple number, a rating of 0 to 100 of their financial stability. If the data, given connectivity, and what I just talked about earlier, it is quite conceivable that data could end up online and could be put online. And that a real estate listing could include the rating of the association's finances as a number, just like it lists the test scores of this local school district. It could have the association's financial rating on a 0 to 100 scale. I know people who are actually trying to make this happen, but I don't know if it will, but this is what I'm talking about, practical solutions that could address these problems. And the notion of professional directors serving on boards has been bandied about for many years, simplified conflict resolution procedures. There are other things as well. These are all quite possible. So lastly, how much time do I have left, Chris? Where are we? Let's see. But what's that? I'm okay? 5? Yeah. I'll take care of the environment in 5 minutes. Climate change, water supply depletion, and energy. Climate change, cities around the globe right now, cities, municipal governments are trying to find solutions to existing and anticipated problems such as a sea level rise. This is an enormous issue. And protection against extreme weather events, fires and other things. And I know this is going on right here as well. Saw it on today's news. And private communities have to do the same things. But where are the resources going to come from for them to address these? Now, in the case of new developments, developers can cite the projects better. And they can address some of these needs better in new projects. They can take these things into account. What do the existing communities do? Like, for example, a condominium that is built close to the beach in an area where there's sea level rise, or places that are in danger from wildfires. Some of the most expensive properties are on coastlines, very close to coastlines. So this is a question of collective responsibility, in my mind. In other words, individual projects, individual developments and condo buildings may not be able to solve this problem alone. This is a situation that I think will face many people, but will require collective action. Water supply depletion, over the past 30 or 40 years, the fastest growing areas at least in the United States, and I think other places as well, have the least water. Arizona, Nevada, California, that's a picture there of Folsom Lake. It's supposed to be a lake. That is supposed to be a lake. That dam used to actually be necessary because it had water behind it. Now it has a puddle behind it and a lot of little rolling hills. That lake is empty. That's one of the biggest reservoirs in Northern California, and it's dry. And this is a result of a 10-year drought. And so this raises questions about the future of housing. How many golf course developments are going to be constructed in areas like this? Swimming pools, water features. And then there's this one, I think, important question. In years past, associations and developers could have whatever regulations they wanted. Declarations of covenants, conditions, and restrictions included provisions that many people might not have liked, but courts generally said, well, we're not going to interfere with it. One exception to that was what we call race-restrictive covenants that were invalidated, covenants that said people of certain demographic groups can't live in this development. Well, those have been invalidated. But other than that, almost anything goes on the ground that will let people live however they want. For the first time, governments are stepping in and saying, you cannot have a restriction in your association's declaration that requires a green lawn. You cannot ban drought-resistant landscape. You cannot ban, you cannot require people to put wood shingles, what we call shake roof shingles, because they go up in flames when sparks land on them. In other words, that now we're starting to see courts and legislatures striking down association rules, which they have not been willing to do in the past because of their environmental impact. And that is an interesting precedent, I think. And lastly, I'll close on this, energy, because this is, I think, a really critical issue. Everyone uses the term sustainability. What we're talking about here often is transportation costs and the location of new housing. What will the price of energy, which I know is low at the moment, but this, I think, probably can't last. What does it do to ex-urban subdivisions, which were very, very popular for a long time? What about, will we see maybe higher density in suburbia, such as what we call traditional, new urbanism type developments, developments that are transit-oriented developments? Will we see more of that in the future? I suspect the answer is yes. And then the question of energy in Germany and in some other places as well. We now see cities that are built around the notion of generating energy. In other words, that the homes, they call it the smart city network. Houses in Germany, entire municipalities, all the houses have solar panels, and they're putting their energy into the grid. In other words, they are net producers of energy because they're using their roofs for solar power generation. And I think we'll probably see a lot more of that in the future. So my concluding thought is this. I'll be talking on Friday about association governance. And I won't go into it except to close on this note. I think that because of these challenges and these changes, there are a lot of opportunities in this type of housing and this type of local governance. But I think they will require a greater institutional support, both private and public, for the communities and their private governments in order to address these changes. And I hope that throughout the conference and then in the years to come that people will begin to ponder that and address the question of increasing institutional support for the associations and their private governments. So thank you very much.
Evan, are you happy to take questions for
Yes.
10 minutes?
I'd be happy to.
If you'd like to raise a question or a comment, please, we've got a microphone across there, microphone here.
Hi Evan, I'm Kathy Sherry. I just wanted to ask if you could comment on something that's happened in the US but it hasn't happened in Australia yet, and that is homeowner associations or communities becoming bankrupt, because our housing industry has been propped up by our mining industry, but that may not last. And I know America's had that experience of quite complex communities with large amounts of facilities when the housing market tanked, communities that are literally bankrupt, and what's happened in the US.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Kathy. That's a really, really interesting question. Well, the bankruptcy laws in the United States are set up in an interesting way, so that many people believe that it will work just fine for an association to go bankrupt. And then in reality, it exposes the owners to terrible consequences. It's one of the worst things that can happen. There have been numerous association bankruptcies or attempted bankruptcies. Some happened in California after there was a major earthquake called the the Northridge earthquake, where associations got into disputes with building contractors over multi-million-dollar repairs. I won't go into all the details. I can if you want, but they're amazing cases where associations ended up, because their boards of directors made some terrible mistakes in dealing with insurance companies and developers, they ended up owing court judgments in the millions of dollars. One was called Simi Valley La Park, there's Oak Park Calabasas, Kingsbury Court, there's several of these developments. These are all important cases. They all ended up in bankruptcy court, which is federal in the United States. So this is the law across the United States. And they all tried the same trick. The trick was, oh, well, you've hit the association with a $6 million judgment, and the association would say, well, we don't have $6 million. And so you can go ahead and levy your judgment against the corporate body, but the owners are untouchable. That sounds good up until you realize what they do. What happens is the bankruptcy judge and the creditors say, yeah, that's fine, except for the fact that you have to turn over your assets. The association's assets are available to settle the judgment. And they say, yeah, well, we have $20,000 in the bank. By the time we get done paying our lawyer, we probably won't even have that. And so the one who lost the case. And so we don't have any assets. And the judge says, oh, yes, you do. You have a very, very important asset. You have the power to assess your owners to pay the debts of the association for which they are legally accountable. So you see where this leads? So then the judge appoints a receiver, and the receiver orders all the association members to pay off the judgment. And this has led to absolute catastrophe in associations when this happens. So the associations try to go bankrupt. And when you go bankrupt, essentially you turn over your assets to the bankruptcy judge, which means you are turning over to the bankruptcy court the power to make the owners pay the judgment. And the only way out of that is to let their unit go in foreclosure, which is what happened to many of these people. So bankruptcy for associations doesn't work. I think as a policy matter, the bankruptcy judges are saying, listen, we can't have an institution that can go millions of dollars in debt, and then the creditors lose everything because they decide not to pay. You see? So ultimately, the owners are going to be responsible for the debts of the association up to the value of their units. And that is exactly what has happened in association bankruptcies across the U.S. And that's not in the CC&Rs, that people don't even know that's going to happen. Yes, sir.
Evan, I'd just like to go back to John Hutchinson, sorry. I'm just going back to what you were saying about the changing demographics and everybody living a bit older.
Yes.
And I guess we're going to see more and more aged people in community development, strata developments, various sort of cooperative living. To me, that says, wow, we are going to have more and more people who we can pull back off the golf courses and have as volunteers to run these schemes. But I'm just wondering how you see all these political and social changes influencing the supply of volunteers, the impetus and willingness to volunteer in the whole world of governance of these schemes.
Yeah. That's one of the things I was going to talk about Friday. Let me touch on that. A recurring problem that almost everyone in the industry points to is that it's very difficult to, in most communities, it's difficult to get enough people to serve on the boards of directors and the committees to keep them all functioning, unless it's the same people, the usual suspects, over and over and over, entrenched in these positions because nobody else wants to do it. And historically, I mean, from at least the early 70s on, people have argued, well, this is like a New England town meeting, and everyone will want to participate, and they have a stake in their community. The problem is that not enough people see it that way. Now, it is conceivable that what we talked about with the skewing of the age distribution, and particularly with respect to home ownership, where in many cases younger people have a hard time even buying a house at all, it's conceivable that that might bring in more people who have the leisure to participate. But if you look at existing seniors communities, is that what's happening? In some cases it is. In other cases, though, people, once they retire, simply want to live a private life. I'm not sure that it's going to solve the problem. They do have more time on their hands, but they may use that time for other things than being involved with the association governance. Perhaps they'll just devote their time to private activities that you mentioned, golf and so forth. Or perhaps, in some cases, I know of individuals doing this, they decide to organize their own group, because they have all this time, their own group in opposition to the existing association, saying, we're going to get to the bottom of what's going on between you and your property management firm. So I think that this can go either way, you see. You can't always count on, the problem is we make the assumption that people will want to be public regarding when they go into these associations, because they'll have the time and the assets and the money. And in some cases they just don't do it. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, can we set it up that if you do want to ask a question, just go ahead and come to the mic and wait. Thank you.
Hello, Ewan. Thank you for being here in Australia. I'm Michelle Sims. I've got a strata management business in a little place called Wagga Wagga. You may have heard of it. I have to ask you something more on my speciality, which is accounting. And you mentioned the fact that the public disclosure of the financial reports of strata schemes could be the way of the future.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that, of course. What I want to know from you, and something that may be implemented, I hope, in our Australian new legislation for strata reform, is the disclosure of the financial reports in the contract for sale for land.
Uh-huh.
Not only that, but also the fact of the title that they're buying, and maybe the need for investors, if they don't get the financial reports, that is, so let's step back and our legislators don't implement that, the requirement for a potential purchaser to come and get an inspection done of the books. What are your views about that, the two aspects? Putting it into the contract or making it compulsory for someone to have a look at the books?
I think both of those are good solutions. The important thing is that buyers have to have access to the information. There's several ways to do it. One is that they get the right to ask for it. In other words, that their attorney upon signing a contract, their attorney has the right to ask for it, and then a statute can specify exactly what they're entitled to do if they ask for it. And second way is what you're suggesting, that it is disclosed immediately, that the duty falls on the association in which the seller lives to immediately disclose the information upon sale. And the third is this right to inspect the books. You know, I haven't seen that in the United States, where they actually have the right to physically inspect the books. That's fascinating. They're all good methods. I wonder if associations probably would find the last method, the inspection of the books, very intrusive and time-consuming. But what I was hoping was that by putting the information online, we could create a market incentive for associations to maybe to listen to their accountants, you know, and their attorneys and the managers who tell them they should have adequate reserves, that in advance, even before there's a contract, that all the information is out there and that it affects the market price of every house in development, and everybody knows it, you know. Everybody knows it up front, and it's built into the real estate market. And I think that incentive would probably work wonders.
I do agree with that, and often we see the first home buyers getting stuck with the little flat, let's call it that for the description that it seems to embody, the place that hasn't been looked after very well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And so then they get lumbered with enormous costs down the track.
Right.
They've bought within their financial capability, but then, you know, the strata costs afterwards become a real strain.
Oh, yes. So, and this happens a lot with buildings, older buildings that are converted from apartments to strata title or condominiums, these conversions, because they may look great on the outside, but the internal systems, the internal infrastructure of the building could be falling apart. So people can go in, young people, first-time home buyers can go in, and this has happened in many, many places, can go in and buy these units, and then in a year, it's discovered that the elevator doesn't work. You know, it needs $1 million repair, and then everyone gets hit with a $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 special assessment to put on a new roof, to rebuild the foundation of the building, to water seal the, etc. And that has happened a lot. And this is something that, you know, proper reserve studies can guard against. But if it's never done because it isn't required, then it's the consumers who are ultimately on the hook.
Can we please thank Evan for his presentation?